Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Dr. Jerrine Tan about Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being, in which we discuss the novel's optimism, the nature of community, and how the book reflects on the act of reading itself. If you haven't listened to the first part, I suggest that you check that out first. And if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of my discussion on A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki with Jerrine Tan. If you didn't catch the first part, I do suggest you watch that first and then join us at this point. So Jerrine, we were talking at the end of the last section about one particular character who's drafted into the Japanese military towards the end of the war, really against his wishes, when he'd much rather be studying French philosophy, basically. And, you know, we talked about there's obviously a very strong Buddhist thread running through it, but there's also an awful lot about, you know, philosophy and ideas from the rest of the world. Do you think, and of course, the location of, you know, the two settings of Canada and Japan is sort of different parts of the world. Do you think it's very consciously trying to sort of bridge different cultures and different ways of understanding, you know, human experience, the planet, all of these big kinds of questions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it has to be, right? Partly because, I mean, again, the novel is so expansive, not just at the level of geography, but also, as you say, you know, it brings up Japanese war history and tries to do so through French philosophy, and Zen and everything. So I think it announces that intentionality that way. Like it has to be trying to, you know, Ozeki, I think, is trying her best to try to like hold the world together while acknowledging all of these discrete differences, which I think is what is so key about this really ambitious transnational global novel, right? Because it's not doing that universalizing thing.
Yeah.
Of, you know, this is how all people are.
Yeah.
But really trying to acknowledge these differences across cultures and places, and even, you know, well, it's the same Japanese family that moves from California to Japan, and we see how the different generations of the family deal with that move, and also different moments in time, the dot-com bubble burst, then, you know, thinking about the end of the Second World War, or the Japanese bubble economy bursting, the tsunami, and all of that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
And you used the
and I
phrase
think
just now. You used the
so just
phrase just now, I think, trying to hold the world together. Do you think it's optimistic with respect to that possibility? And I ask that for a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, reading a lot of contemporary literature, particularly novels that are consciously transnational, or we might say transcultural, my feeling is that a lot of contemporary literature is pretty pessimistic. And I feel there's a sense we have to have dialogue. There's no alternative, but really a sense that it's difficult. It doesn't always work. Language can be as much a tool for harm as it can be for understanding. And specifically to A Tale for the Time Being, you know, okay, you have this story that has arrived in Canada, and you have a sympathetic reader in Ruth, but it's arrived there precisely through a kind of disaster and the sort of ecological catastrophes that, you know, it's a very much a connected world, but it connected in a negative sense many times. You know, the desire for, you know, material stuff is causing harm elsewhere, right? So those are the two reasons for that question. Yeah, I mean, basically, do you think it is optimistic in the sense of being able to achieve maybe understanding or communication between these very disparate locations, or not so much, in fact?
Yeah, I think it's optimistic. Or at the very least, it's, like I said, participatory, right? Or modeling a form of continued what would you call it, optimism, but a need to participate in spite of a pessimistic and bleak landscape. I
Okay.
think, as you say, we have no choice, right?
Mm,
So rather than dwelling in the bleak and the pessimistic, what can we do? We still have to try, right?
mm,
And I think um, it's part of, I think, a real feminist, transnational feminist ethic that I think the novel has.
mm,
Um, same with, say, like Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, right? Where that essay, ends on the note of, well, the subaltern cannot speak, but are we allowed to, give up the fight, right? To
mhm,
give up where we cannot stop trying to represent, even
mhm,
so. Um, and I think we see that we see Ozeki trying to do that at multiple levels in the
mhm,
novel. Um, so before you were talking about the narrative voice and Ruth and how, in a way, we never get Nao's voice directly.
mm,
And I found myself thinking a lot about Lolita as I read this novel, because both novels engage in a form of prosopopoeia, right? Where, we get the sense, we think we're hearing from this protagonist, right?
mm.
Dolores Hayes or Nao, but really it's reported speech,
Yeah.
right? Um, and yet, I think A Tale for the Time Being is so different from Lolita. And Ruth Ozeki, Ruth of the novel and Ruth Ozeki, the
Mm,
author, are so different from Humbert Humbert, right? And the difference, I think, is whereas Humbert's narrative voice is controlling and singular, um, in Ozeki's novel, the novel itself is pluralistic,
mm,
right? And I read that as a kind of um, what Sarah Ahmed, I think, might call feminist citational practices,
mm,
right? Where everything is a citation. And in the end, we as readers, and Ruth as a reader of now, can only begin to put together a story, begin to hold this world together,
mm,
novelistic and the real world, by relying on the community, right?
mm,
So there are all these translational practices that are modeled in the novel as well, which I find super interesting,
mm,
even though they live on this tiny little island with
mm.
nobody, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like Benoit, the dump guy, is that what they call him? Translates the French,
Yeah.
and then someone else translates the Japanese.
Mm,
And when they can't, they send her to somebody else, and then they're not confident of their English, but they have a son who goes to McGill,
mm,
who says, "Oh, I'll correct your English." So it's really a community effort,
mm,
and that's how I see. And I mean, Ozeki herself has said in interviews, right, that she views stepping into the novel, participation, as really important. And I
mm,
think that's how in the novel she models this form of participation through community as a way of
mm,
holding this very broken world together.
mm. And I think what you just said, about this community effort, this sort of collaborative aspect of basically the translation and the process of understanding I was going to say the text, but it's actually multiple texts that sort of come together. I think in talking about these, you gestured towards something you said earlier, which was, I think you said a transnational feminist ethics. For people who might be interested, could you just say more explicitly, you referred to two big names, Spivak and Ahmed. Could you just draw out a little bit more what you mean by that without going too much into a real deep, or maybe going too much in a very dense theoretical register, but in simple terms, what do you mean by that phrase?
Well, I guess the reference to Spivak, I was thinking of, well, now is, who knows if she's dead or not, right? And we
Mm,
know that she's a young girl who's bullied and so on. Um, she has her diary, but the person who is representing her is Ruth. And so there I see a form of, how do we speak for someone with no power,
mm,
right? We can't. It's always kind of appropriative, but how best can we do it, right? We can't just shrug off the responsibility. And
mm,
I feel like Ozeki is making a sincere effort at modeling what that might look like in this novel. Um, and then with the Ahmed, I mean, she talks about feminist citational practices where, citation is really important in acknowledging work and bringing work together. And I think the novel really is a text of citation, right? You mentioned earlier all these footnotes that Ruth or Ozeki makes in the novel. That's such a labor of love, right? In spite of Ruth, the character, being really anxious about her lack of productivity. Like she's always talking about how she has writer's block. She's been working on this novel forever, but she's actually incredibly generative, right? And she's constantly citing and researching and accrediting
Yeah.
work to people. So that to me feels like the antithesis of, say, Humbert, right? Which could encapsulate maybe the kind of oppressive patriarchal male figure,
Controlling.
literary figure, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking about the sort of footnotes you get in, which could, I mean, it's done really well. It could be a sort of irritating effect, but it works really well, I think. But I was also thinking about the effect it has on the process of reading for us, because, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, you have quite a lot of words that in the flow of the main text are not translated, and you maybe get kanji, the actual Japanese characters, and then it's footnoted. So you have to go to it. And, I think in other, sometimes you get text where something is not translated and it'll tend to be italicized. And if you don't understand it, I think the mental process can be to skip it. And that might be the temptation of the tale for the time being, except you have the footnotes. Of course, you click if you're reading it electronically, which I did, or you go to wherever it is. So you have to actually slow down. It takes you into the research in a sense. And it's I guess, a more thoughtful process of reading and a non-linear one as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think the character Ruth says this, right? That she tries to slow down her reading as well.
Oh,
And I
yeah, I
guess
hadn't connected it with that part. Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
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 um, work recently on like slow reading and slow
yeah.
research and things.
So, yeah,
Um,
the Ruth character says she wants to slow down to try to read at the pace it was written, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah,
Also a kind of wishful thinking, right? That if she reads slowly, then, whatever she dreads might happen at the end will not happen yet. And I think
yeah,
that's the textual, metaphysical aspect of the novel as well. That's really
yeah.
cool. Now brings into being this reader-writer relation.
Mm,
But then we also get implicated because we're also readers, right?
yeah,
And we realize that if she thinks if Ruth feels she's being conjured as a reader through Now's writing, then we as readers are also being conjured, right? So that's yet another form of this
mm,
participatory reading, I think that Ozeki is really interested in, where
yeah,
we can also slow down our reading, right? And
yes.
how we read also seems to have bearing on this world. I mean, both the novelistic one and our own world.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an awful lot in there about the nature of reading and the effect that reading has, isn't there? Um, and again, thinking back to sort of studying your real sort of high postmodernist stuff from the 60s where it's all super self-conscious. And I mean, you can enjoy that kind of text, but it feels maybe a bit dated now and could be a bit irritating. But I mean, Tale for the Time Being isn't, still a real sort of a story that takes you along with it, and those aspects that ask you to reflect on, yeah, the metaphysical nature of reading and how it constructs the subject you're reading about is, doesn't come across as kind of tricky or pretentious or inaccessible. I don't think, does it?
Right. I mean, it's an awfully sincere book, is
Mm,
I guess what I feel.
yeah, yeah. Um, and I mean, another thing you just mentioned was, Ruth is living on this really isolated island, yet somehow there is this community around her that's able to translate and interpret the texts that have arrived from Japan, from across the ocean. So there is this kind of contrast between isolation and connectedness, because, as you've already mentioned, the scope of the novel is one that comes from the interconnectedness of events, which is both spatial and temporal, right? You have stuff sort of going through the generations, and you have stuff going outwards from its point of origin. Yet the key events are really taking place in very isolated places. You've got Ruth in this little island, and then in particular, Jiko teaching Now how to meditate in this tiny little temple up a hill that, they can barely find. So, and how do you see that relationship? What's it saying about our position in a very connected world? Is it, I mean, you mentioned earlier that the Buddhist stuff is not necessarily, or is certainly not advocating for just limp passivity. How can we link this to sort of questions of connectedness and isolation? Because the isolation in some sense does now a lot of good, but you need to be connected to affect the world in a positive way as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right? This runs through the novel at so many different levels. There's the intergenerational, the temporal, the spatial, and then also the digital, I guess, right? Because the internet moves over all of this as well. She's part of her suffering is because there's cyberbullying happening as well, right? They put things up on the internet, they say mean things about her and things like that. And then we come to realize that part of her father's troubles were also internet related, right? And tech related. So, I don't know if that's a spoiler, but then is it? Well, maybe I won't go there.
Well, I wanted to talk about her father's role, which is definitely a spoiler, but I think it doesn't ruin the story, I don't think, if we just talk about what it is. So her father is, he's a tech guy in California. This is where it now grows up before going back to Japan. And that upbringing is part of the reason she's bullied. But the dad works on, he's producing, it's initially gaming software, isn't it? Where you're sort of piloting something, and then it's realized, or the company realizes this could have a military use. In other words, it's making flying drones into targets fun. And yeah, I'll stop there so as not to spoil too much. So again, I think I hadn't really thought of that when you brought it up, but again, it sort of connects. There is a sort of connectedness, but an isolation, because, if you're on a computer game, you may just be sitting in front of your screen. But obviously this is having a profound effect on the person whose home is just being hit by a drone bomb or something, for example.
Right. So I don't know. I mean, I guess the novel models both good connections and bad connections, right? Because what haunts her father about his job is how it will be used. And he could choose to disconnect from it, which is what that technology wants to do, right? Let's make killing people fun. If you just think it's a game and you get really good at the game, then you can just kill people from really far away, who are really far away. So that's, I suppose, an instance of, disconnection that is really perverse. But then is this a spoiler again? Well, I mean, he uses his internet and tech know-how, finally, right? So I think part of his suicidal, the reason for being suicidal is he was so horrified at how his work could be used that he decided to opt out of the world, right? He became a hikikomori, which is the term for, in Japan, people who literally close themselves off from the world. They stay at home, they don't go out. A lot of them, game or are on the internet. So again, you're connected in that way, right? The way that the internet is so enables connection, but in a way it's not real connection, and it can be a kind of corrosive connection that in fact causes you to disconnect. for yourself, right?
Mm,
Um, but ultimately he participates, right?
mm,
He uses his expertise and knowledge to do something in the
mm,
world. So I think there's often throughout the novel there are these instances of setting up something that, you know, looks like connection or sorry, a form of disconnection that seems like a corrective that's
mm.
actually not the way forward, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, participating, right, connecting, however flawed or annoying or irritating. I mean, Ruth is like, oh, my neighbors are so annoying. Oh,
Mm,
Muriel keeps bugging me. But in the end, they rely on each other. They appreciate each other for their expertise and know-how, and
yeah.
something comes together out of that.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right that it models good forms of this kind of connection, but also negative ones as well. The internet is the obvious one. The bullying of now is really horrific. But I'm also thinking of you have collectives that are very harmful. Again, the bullying, you have a class coming together as a body, but excluding one person from it. Um, and also actually back into the historical stuff, the sort of collective lockstep march towards the end, in the war, is certainly isn't a good model of participation. So I wonder if,
Yeah,
just to finish,
absolutely.
can we sort of draw out from the text what is a good form of participation in this book? Sorry, that's a really big question just to answer off the cuff, isn't it?
What my read is, I think the lesson ultimately is that we can't opt out of the
Mm,
world, right? No matter
mm,
how bleak and pessimistic things look, and we have to participate. Um, but it has to be thoughtful and
mm,
sincere and generous,
mm,
right? The way that Jiko models, I mean,
mm.
she talks about the elevator, right? How she's like, oh, I just want to die and go to rest in heaven or something, but
Mm.
she's waiting for more people to be enlightened or something. So
Yeah.
it entails um personal investment, right? Which sometimes means sacrifice.
Mm.
Um, and also to participate in spite of knowing that it won't be a perfect outcome, right? Or it won't be entirely idealistic, um, but that you have to do so nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I agree that ultimately it is an optimistic book, but it takes some getting there, doesn't it? I mean, the stuff that now
Yeah, I
goes
mean,
through is, yeah.
well, but I think that is why it's optimistic, right? Like it
You
were,
can come through these stuff, yeah.
yeah, like if it were merely, just that tonal thing, right? Hi, I'm now, I'm
Mm,
here in a cafe, then that wouldn't really be optimistic. That would be kind of pessimistic, I think.
yeah.
But to see her kind of go through the trials and tribulations, and Ruth also emerge different from all of this, that to me is what is optimistic.
Great. Well, let's finish on that optimistic note. So, hope everybody has enjoyed this discussion of A Tale for the time being. Thank you so much, Jerrine, for joining me and for your really interesting and enlightening thoughts on the novel.
Thanks so much
And
for having me.
you're very welcome. And please join us another time for another aspect of world literature.